When it comes to action film stars, Arnold Schwarzenegger is my definitive all-time favorite. In the 80s and 90s, he was top of the box office in everything from Predator, Total Recall, The Running Man, Terminator 1 and 2, and I've enjoyed his career all the way through. The Terminator franchise has been around since 1984, and it's crazy to think that this film series has been around for almost 40 years. Terminator was a great blend of science fiction and horror. Terminator 2 was one of my all-time favorite movies back in 1991, and looking back on it, it touches on so many themes about what it means to be human, coupled with fantastic special effects that still hold up today, which is saying a lot for a lot of 90s action films. Of course, Terminator has had a number of sequels over the years, everything from Terminator 3, Rise of Machines, which was okay, but certainly a letdown after Terminator 2, Terminator Salvation, which I can respect for trying something new and placing everything in the future, ultimately not that great of a movie. Terminator Genesis, which was universally reviled, but to be honest, I actually kind of liked that one. I didn't think it was great, but I liked it well enough, and I think that all goes back to Arnold Schwarzenegger. But there was always something missing with these films. With 2 of the 3 films, you had Arnold Schwarzenegger reprising his role as the Terminator, and then one of the films, Salvation, he was actually replaced by a CG double. Didn't really do a lot, nice little shout out, but the CG's pretty awful in that one. When Terminator Dark Fate was announced, I was a little skeptical. Believe me, you can only be burned so many times by these movies. But they promised Linda Hamilton back, and going into that, I kept an open mind. I wanted to see what this new series was going to do, especially when they said all those other films don't matter. This is directly set after Terminator 2 Judgment Day. How did it turn out? Overall, I thought it was a pretty good film. It certainly had some issues, but we'll get into that as well. So, for all intents and purposes, be prepared for spoilers. Terminator Dark Fate is now the second Terminator 3 in the film series. And interestingly enough, it's also the 3rd attempt in trying to make a new trilogy. Salvation was supposed to be one, Genesis was supposed to be one, and now this is the 3rd film in the original Terminator trilogy of Terminator 1 and Terminator 2, and then is set to do this other whole new trilogy, which, considering box office records right now, it's not looking so good, but we'll get to that as well. One of the biggest things I've taken away from modern movies is never trust the blogs and never trust the social media. Everyone was trying to promote this as this uber feminist film, and honestly, have you seen the Terminator series? Everything focuses around Sarah Connor. She is the lead character. She is as important to the Terminator film series as Ellen Ripley is to Alien. And from what I learned, that was the missing element. All these new Terminator sequels, despite having Arnold Schwarzenegger back, and believe me, I love him, he is definitively the face of the Terminator series. Linda Hamilton, Sarah Connor, well, she's certainly the heart. Linda Hamilton does a great job in this film. She actually took a break from acting for quite a while there, and now she's come back, and she's reestablished the role of Sarah Connor, who's definitely older, more bitter, more broken. And it's really interesting in the sense that both the Terminator and Sarah Connor are veterans of a war that never existed. Yet they have all the scars and the damage and everything else that comes with it. Basically, they're suffering from something that never happened in the long run. Terminator Dark Fate does stick to the whole ending of Terminator 2, where John Connor, Sarah Connor, and the T-800 stopped Skynet. Skynet is, for all intents and purposes, done. This is kind of where it gets sketchy, because now Skynet has apparently sent all these Arnold Schwarzenegger-esque Terminators all throughout the years trying to hunt down the Connors, although it's kind of a moot point if Skynet no longer exists. I guess they did this before they were shut down. Terminator timelines are so messed up, it's a headache trying to figure out what's going on really with these films. They start out this film with just going for it, and they kill John Connor in 1998. I have a couple thoughts about this whole scene. Number one, I can kind of understand John Connor is essentially irrelevant now. Skynet's done. He's no longer a savior. He will never be a savior because Skynet just doesn't exist. So, I mean, watching him just grow up and just being a guy who was supposed to be somebody but now never will would be kind of a depressing film. Granted, 27 years later, it's going to be really hard to bring back Edward Furlong because, well, to be honest, he doesn't look like what he did back then, and that's even beyond just getting older. The best thing I can suggest is just Google. That's about all I can really say. That said, they digitally de-aged Edward Furlong, Linda Hamilton, and Arnold Schwarzenegger in that scene. A lot of these de-aging effects look really bad in movies. It's only been the last few years where it actually looks good, like some of the more recent Marvel films. I think they finally figured out the technology. Here it looks great. It may as well have been a cut scene from the original Terminator 2 because it looks flawless. You really can't see it. Granted, in a couple years, it might not hold up as well, but for now, it looks good. But the whole gist is the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator kills John Connor. Now he just has 27 years to ponder his existence and the consequences of his actions. So whereas the T-800 from Terminator 2 was able to interact with a kid and learn human emotion from direct contact, this new Terminator has gone out and lived an entire life. So he's learned about what humanity is on a much grander scale than the Terminator 2 version did. The new movie is primarily set in Mexico, which makes sense. Sarah Connor is a wanted fugitive after everything that went down in Terminator 2. She's on America's Most Wanted, and as soon as she hits back into American soil, she'd be arrested instantly, as later proven in this film. You don't really see Sarah Connor or the Terminator coming back until much later in the film. This new film focuses on Danny, who basically fits into the Sarah Connor trope. And then, of course, there's the future soldier that's there to protect Danny from more evil Terminators that are even more high-tech than the T-1000. This girl named Grace is essentially the new Kyle Reese. The new Terminator is interesting enough. It's a Rev 9 Terminator played by Gabriel Luna. He's basically like a symbiote. There's the skeleton version and then the human-esque looking version, and they can merge together and split apart. It's almost like Venom. It's an interesting idea. I think one of the things that I noticed about this film, the special effects are very good in it. They're very good. I don't really have any outstanding issues. There's one or two scenes, of course. There's a couple muddled scenes that don't really show the action as well as I wish that they did. But overall, it looks really good. The biggest thing, though, is when Terminator 2 came out in 1991, it was mind-blowing. It was just out of control crazy because you had this silver liquid metal Terminator morphing into things and blending into things and turning into people, and it's great, and it still looks solid today. While everything looks great, the film doesn't have the wow factor just because of, I think we've seen so many other big budget, high special effects films. It just doesn't really break new ground again, but it's competent and works well for what it is. Danny and Grace are met by Sarah Connor, and they all team up to go after this new Terminator, which is even harder and more indestructible to kill than all the other previous Terminators, which they just ramp up over the series of these movies. And at this point, the original T-800 just looks kind of antiquated. And it's really too bad because it was an effective killer, but with all these new special effects things, it instantly feels outdated with all these high-tech, uber-cool Terminators. Eventually, the group leaves Mexico, goes to Texas, and runs into the current Terminator, Carl, as he's now known, who's an interior decorator with the family. It's funny to think that the T-800 is a settled-down family man, and he has admittedly some of the best lines in the entire movie. He describes placing drapes in a little girl's room with such clinical precision. That whole scene, and it was kind of like a side background scene, but I got the biggest laughs out of that entire scene. It was just funny. And he has a couple good one-liners, and of course, you know, as they respect that he's an aged Terminator, and he's certainly not top of the line anymore, but it's always nice seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger back in action. I feel like the first act is really solid. I feel like everyone does a competent job. I think the action scenes are really good. They do a truck driving scene because what self-respecting Terminator film doesn't have an epic truck driving scene where multiple cars are being destroyed and killing people by the dozens and just going through just wanton destruction down a highway. And this movie certainly delivers. It's a great scene. It's a lot of high action that really felt like the first two Terminators. And they make it very clear in this film that they really want to be like the first two Terminator films. Everything, I think, holds up until they meet Carl. While the initial scene of all of them hanging out in Carl's front yard drinking a beer while they discuss the fate of the world, they do all these things that are basically, all right, so we're going to have a plan, and we've got to get all these specialized weapons, and I've got my own private reserve, and we're going to take my van, and all this stuff. What really is problematic for me is All this stuff is set up as very important until it isn't. At one point, they drive the van onto a plane. They're having a high stakes action scene where they're flying along. Of course, the Terminator finds them in the air, and there's a huge explosion and a big airplane fight, and the airplane crashes. And it's like all these things that they set up, none of it matters. It's just all like, oh, well, the EMP bomb that they went through hell and high water to get, lost opportunity. They had this one soldier that was helping Sarah Connor, and I really thought it would have been Danny Dyson, who was the son of Miles Dyson from the second film. It would have made more sense to have him be like the military guy instead of just some random guy, but, you know, I guess they just didn't think that far ahead. And of course they crashed, and there's more fighting and more mangling and all this stuff that they bring, everything from Carl's van to a Humvee to weapons, it's all gone, lost, none of it matters. And they go to what I'm guessing is Hoover Dam in Boulder, and they go to have their big final confrontation. And the final confrontation, again, is great, because Grace, who is an augmented human, and the Terminator, and Sarah Connor, and they try to make Danny a little bit more fierce, but I don't feel like she's the strongest element of the film, whereas I felt Sarah Connor started out very meek in the first film, but eventually grew into her role. I don't really feel that transition was as good in this first film. I don't think it's a question of acting. I just think I don't think they just made that transition work as well as they could have. The one thing that they did with Danny's character, because of course they really followed all the beats of the Terminator films, like all of them, even the ones that they've chosen to cast aside. It's the same thing for pretty much every movie except for Salvation. They have a super soldier from the future that comes back in time to protect the target from an evil robot, and that is the same plot beat for all the Terminator films. That's just what they do. I wish they'd try some other new things. I think Salvation, had it been a better movie, might have opened up some new opportunities, but again, you really realize that the heart of this film is Sarah Connor, and without her, they just haven't figured it out. With this film, it feels so much more like a Terminator film. This feels like a legitimate Terminator sequel, and that's a great thing. They lean very heavily on all the homages and everything else, because you can kind of feel that sense like Star Wars Force Awakens, or even Halloween 2018, where they really want you to like this. Here's all the things that you loved before. We're going to give it to you, but now we're going to set up and use this as a transitional phase into this new story, which overall I'm okay with. I liked Force Awakens, and I liked the new Halloween, and I liked this film. I just think there's a couple things that they could have done better, especially that big action sequence kind of in the middle towards the climax before the big confrontation at the end. I didn't feel that was very strong. I think Terminator Dark Fate had a couple things working against it. A couple of it was, I think there's a sense of an audience burnout after so many reboot attempts after Terminator 3, that I think people were just burned out. It's like, how many times can you reboot a franchise? And now they're doing that new thing where X amount of sequels don't matter anymore. Here's the true direct sequel. Here's that. It's so frustrating and convoluted. And these movies, they happened, whether they're great or not. And they've tried to reboot Terminator so many times over and over. And they finally get the right elements in place where they make it feel more action-oriented, with bigger action sequences. Linda Hamilton, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I think it might be too little too late. And I think a lot of the social media and blogging sites sent a really bad preliminary idea of what this film was going to be like. There's no pro-politics stances in it, there's no agendas, there's no anything. This was always a female-centric series from the beginning, and it's fine. It's not preachy at all. It's just trying to make a decent Terminator sequel, which I can completely respect, and overall I felt they did that. As far as Terminator Dark Fate goes, it works as a suitable ending for Terminator 1 and Terminator 2, with hopes of doing a new trilogy, franchise, anything, if that's ever in the cards. I don't know. I feel a lot of these films are basically ways for my generation to say goodbye to characters that we grew up with, whether we were kids or young adults or whatever. There's admittedly a lot of love for all these franchises that they're doing all this with. Ghostbusters and Star Wars and Halloween and Terminator, and all these actors and actresses are now in their 60s and 70s. They're not going to be able to do this forever. So it's a nice way to connect, pass along the baton, and give it off to a new generation by giving one last warm hello and goodbye to all your favorite characters, and then they get a chance to do whatever they want to. And hopefully for whatever the studios decide with this new interpretation, I hope we're invited along for the ride as well. I'd certainly like to be able to see what new stories and characters and ideas they come up with, and hopefully, and especially in the case of Terminator, they'll be able to expand past that protector saves from evil robot concept and do something new, try something new. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Terminator Dark Fate. I had a pretty good time with it. I can recommend it well enough. It's certainly a worthy successor to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, even with a few issues here and there. In light of everything else, it's the best they've done in years. Anyway, thanks so much for checking out my video, and I will see you next time. Take care.